Number 1. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. seemed like the embodiment of law and order when he joined the Martin County Sheriff's Office in Florida in 1972, but behind his badge lurked one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. Born on March 25, 1946, in Wisconsin, Schaefer grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, where neighbors remembered him as an odd, isolated child who tortured animals and exhibited disturbing behavior toward girls in his neighborhood. His mother, Doris Schaefer, was reportedly domineering and emotionally abusive, while his father remained largely absent from his emotional development. Despite these red flags, Schaefer managed to complete his education, earning a teaching certificate and briefly working as a teacher before pursuing a career in law enforcement. His application to the Wilton Manors Police Department in 1971 was initially successful, but he was fired after just 6 months due to his association with a teenage girl he had approached while on duty, a violation that should have ended his law enforcement career permanently. However, the small Martin County Sheriff's Office, desperate for personnel, hired him in 1972 without thoroughly investigating his previous dismissal. On July 21, 1972, Schaefer was patrolling near Stuart, Florida, when he encountered 2 teenage hitchhikers, 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and 17-year-old Pamela Wells. Using his authority as a deputy sheriff, he told the girls that hitchhiking was dangerous and offered to drive them to the beach himself. Instead, he drove them to a remote wooded area, forced them from the vehicle at gunpoint, tied them to trees, and subjected them to psychological torture, describing in graphic detail how he planned to rape and murder them. He placed nooses around their necks and positioned them on tree roots, telling them that when they tired, they would hang themselves. Then, inexplicably, he left them there while he reported for his shift, apparently intending to return and complete the murders. The terrified girls managed to free themselves and immediately reported the incident to the sheriff's office. When confronted, Schaefer claimed he was merely trying to scare the girls to teach them about the dangers of hitchhiking, an excuse that convinced no one. He was immediately fired and arrested for assault and false imprisonment. While Schaefer was awaiting trial for this incident, 2 more teenage girls went missing in the same area. On September 27, 1972, 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup disappeared after telling friends they were going to the beach. Their decomposed remains were discovered months later in April 1973, buried in a wooded area near Fort Lauderdale. The bodies showed evidence of torture, mutilation, and hanging, a signature method that would become central to the investigation. Schaefer immediately became the prime suspect, and when investigators searched his mother's home where he had been living, they discovered a horrifying trove of evidence. Hidden in the attic were numerous personal items belonging to missing women and girls, including jewelry, clothing, identification cards, and photographs. More disturbingly, they found Schaefer's detailed journals and stories describing torture, murder, and necrophilia, written in first-person narrative that closely matched the details of unsolved disappearances across Florida and beyond. Some entries described hanging women from trees and cutting them down repeatedly, reviving them only to torture them further. The evidence was overwhelming, and Schaefer was charged with the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. His trial began in October 1973, and prosecutors presented the physical evidence found in his possession, along with testimony about his prior attack on Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, establishing a clear pattern of behavior. The defense argued that the journals were merely fictional writings and that the presence of victims' belongings was circumstantial, but the jury deliberated for only an hour before returning guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge D.C. Smith sentenced Schaefer to 2 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released. However, investigators believed Schaefer's crimes extended far beyond these 2 confirmed murders. In the years following his conviction, detectives from multiple jurisdictions interviewed him about dozens of unsolved disappearances and murders of young women throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The items found in his possession linked him to at least 30 additional victims, and some investigators believe the true number may exceed 80. Among the suspected victims were college students, hitchhikers, runaways, and young women who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Schaefer reveled in the attention, sometimes hinting at other crimes but never providing enough information to confirm his involvement, playing cruel games with the families of missing women who desperately sought closure. While imprisoned, Schaefer became a prolific writer, penning fictional stories and a book titled Killer Fiction that contained thinly veiled accounts of murders, which he claimed were purely imaginative. He granted interviews to journalists and researchers, often contradicting himself and providing false information to maintain relevance and control. He married twice while in prison, both times to women who corresponded with him and believed in his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. The case took a final dark turn on December 3, 1995, when Schaefer was found stabbed to death in his cell at Florida State Prison. His cellmate, Vincent Rivera, who was serving time for murder, confessed to killing Schaefer, claiming it was in self-defense after Schaefer made sexual advances and attacked him. Rivera received an additional life sentence for the murder, and while some investigators suspected there might be more to the story, the case was closed. Schaefer's death meant that the families of his suspected victims would never receive the answers they desperately sought. The Gerard Schaefer case exposed critical failures in law enforcement hiring practices and background checks during the 1970s. The fact that he was able to obtain another police position after being fired for misconduct with a minor demonstrated a catastrophic lack of communication between agencies and inadequate screening procedures. His case became a cautionary tale used in police training programs across the country, emphasizing the importance of thorough background investigations and psychological evaluations for law enforcement candidates. The trauma experienced by the community of Martin County was profound, as residents struggled to comprehend how someone sworn to protect them had been hunting their children. Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, the two survivors who escaped his initial attack, lived with the psychological scars of their ordeal for decades, knowing that their narrow escape came at the cost of other girls who were not as fortunate. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of young hitchhikers during an era when the practice was common, leading to public safety campaigns warning young people about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers, even those in positions of authority. Today, Gerard Schaefer is remembered as one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in American history, a man who weaponized the trust placed in law enforcement to satisfy his murderous compulsions, and whose confirmed and suspected victim count continues to haunt investigators and families decades after his death. Number 2. Antoinette Frank. Antoinette Frank appeared to be a dedicated young police officer when she joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993, but within 2 years, she would commit one of the most shocking crimes in the city's history, executing 3 people during a restaurant robbery and betraying every principle of law enforcement. Born on April 30, 1971, in Opelousas, Louisiana, Frank grew up in New Orleans' 7th Ward in difficult circumstances. Her father, Adam Frank, was largely absent from her life, and her mother struggled to raise Antoinette and her siblings in poverty. Despite these challenges, Frank excelled academically and seemed determined to build a better life for herself. She attended Xavier University briefly before deciding to pursue a career in law enforcement, driven, she later claimed, by a desire to help her community and make a difference. She applied to the New Orleans Police Department in 1993, at the age of 22, during a period when the department was desperately trying to increase its numbers and was lowering standards to attract recruits. During her psychological evaluation, the examining psychologist noted concerns about Frank's suitability for police work, specifically identifying personality traits that suggested she lacked empathy and showed signs of being potentially unfit for the position. The psychologist recommended that Frank not be hired, but these warnings were ignored by NOPD administrators who were under pressure to fill positions quickly. Frank was accepted into the police academy and graduated in February 1993, beginning her career as a patrol officer in the 7th District. Initially, Frank received positive evaluations from her supervisors and seemed to be a competent, if unremarkable, officer. However, beneath this professional facade, she was accumulating significant debt and becoming increasingly desperate for money. She began moonlighting as a security guard at various locations around New Orleans, including the Kim on Restaurant, a Vietnamese establishment in eastern New Orleans owned by the Vu family. The restaurant was operated by Chow Vu, along with her siblings, and employed several family members. Frank became friendly with the Vu family, frequently eating at the restaurant even when she was not working security, and she was regarded as a trusted protector by the owners. Unknown to the Vu family, Frank had been carefully observing the restaurant's operations, noting when cash deposits were made and where money was kept. She had also developed a relationship with Rogers Lacaze, a man with an extensive criminal history who was involved in drug dealing and armed robbery. Lacaze, born on August 8, 1973, was several years younger than Frank and had been in and out of the criminal justice system since his early teens. The exact nature of their relationship remains unclear, with some suggesting they were romantically involved while others believe their connection was purely criminal. But what is certain is that Frank began providing Lacaze with information about potential robbery targets, using her position as a police officer to facilitate his crimes. On the night of March 4, 1995, Frank was working in approved detail as a security guard at a nearby restaurant when she left her post and drove to the Kim on restaurant shortly before closing time. She entered through the front door in her police uniform, carrying her service weapon, and encountered Officer Ronald Williams, a fellow NOPD officer who was working security at the Kim on that night. Williams, a 25-year-old officer who had been with the department for 2 years, knew Frank professionally and had no reason to suspect anything unusual about her presence. In the kitchen area, Chow Vu and her 17-year-old brother, Quoc Vu, were preparing to close the restaurant, while Chow's 24-year-old brother, Ha Vu, was also present. Within moments of Frank's arrival, Rogers Lacaze entered the restaurant through the back door, wearing dark clothing and a mask, carrying a 9mm handgun. What happened next was captured partially by the restaurant's surveillance cameras and later reconstructed through the testimony of the sole survivor. Lacaze immediately opened fire on Officer Williams, shooting him in the head and back as he stood near the front counter. Williams, caught completely off guard, fell to the floor mortally wounded. Rather than defending her fellow officer or attempting to stop the gunman, Antoinette Frank drew her own weapon and joined Lacaze in the attack. She walked over to the fallen Officer Williams and fired additional shots into his body, executing him as he lay helpless on the floor. Chow Vu, hearing the gunshots, grabbed her brother Quoc and hid in a walk-in refrigerator, pulling the door closed. Ha Vu and another employee, Quang Vu, attempted to flee but were caught by Frank and Lacaze. In cold blood, Frank shot Ha Vu in the head and back, killing him instantly, and then shot Quang Vu multiple times, leaving him for dead. Frank and Lacaze then began searching the restaurant for money, ransacking the office and register areas. They found several $1,000s in cash and restaurant receipts. As they searched, they called out for anyone else in the building to come out, attempting to locate Chow and Quoc Vu in the refrigerator. Chow held her brother in the darkness of the refrigerator, both of them silent and terrified, barely breathing as they heard Frank's voice calling for them to show themselves. After what seemed like an eternity, Frank and Lacaze left the restaurant with the stolen money. Chow Vu waited several more minutes before emerging from the refrigerator to discover the carnage. Officer Ronald Williams lay dead near the entrance, shot multiple times. Her brother Ha Vu was dead in the kitchen area. Quang Vu, though shot multiple times, was still alive but critically wounded. Chow immediately called 911, reporting the murders and providing a description of the attackers. Incredibly, within minutes of the shooting, Antoinette Frank returned to the Kim on restaurant, now calling in the crime scene over her police radio and arriving in her marked patrol car as if she were responding to the emergency. She approached the scene with her weapon drawn, attempting to portray herself as a responding officer. However, Chow Vu immediately identified Frank as one of the shooters, pointing at her and screaming that she had killed her brother and Officer Williams. Other officers arriving on the scene were initially confused, unable to comprehend that one of their own could be responsible for such a crime. Frank vehemently denied the accusations, claiming that Chow was mistaken and traumatized, but the evidence quickly mounted against her. Quang Vu, despite his critical injuries, survived and also identified Frank as one of the shooters. The surveillance footage, though grainy, showed Frank's distinctive body shape and movements. Most damning, ballistics testing revealed that the bullets that killed Officer Williams and the Vu family members came from 2 weapons: a 9mm handgun belonging to Rogers Lacaze and Frank's department-issued 9mm service weapon. Frank was arrested within hours of the shooting and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Rogers Lacaze was arrested shortly thereafter and faced the same charges. The city of New Orleans was stunned. The New Orleans Police Department, already plagued by corruption scandals and public distrust, faced its darkest hour as one of its officers stood accused of murdering a fellow cop and innocent civilians during an armed robbery. The trial of Antoinette Frank began in September 1995 and became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of Chow Vu and Quang Vu, the ballistics evidence linking Frank's service weapon to the murders, surveillance footage, and testimony from other officers about Frank's financial difficulties and her relationship with Lacaze. The defense attempted to argue that Lacaze had acted alone and that Frank had been at the scene but had not participated in the murders, a claim that was thoroughly demolished by the eyewitness testimony and physical evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution presented evidence of Frank's lack of remorse and her attempts to manipulate the investigation, including her bizarre return to the crime scene. The jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and Judge Frank Morello sentenced Antoinette Frank to death by lethal injection. Rogers Lacaze was tried separately, also convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and sentenced to death. The case devastated the New Orleans Police Department and led to significant reforms in hiring practices and psychological screening. The fact that Frank had been hired despite a psychologist's recommendation against it raised serious questions about the department's judgment and priorities. Officer Ronald Williams was honored posthumously, remembered as a dedicated officer who was murdered by someone he trusted. His family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city, arguing that the NOP's negligent hiring practices had directly led to his death. The Vu family was left shattered by the loss of Ha Vu and the trauma experienced by Chow and Kwok, who had witnessed the brutality firsthand. Quang Vu survived his injuries but required extensive medical treatment and carried both physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. Antoinette Frank has remained on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women for nearly 3 decades, one of only 2 women on Louisiana's death row. She has filed numerous appeals, all of which have been denied, and has maintained her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against her. In various interviews from prison, she has offered conflicting accounts of the events of March 4, 1995, sometimes claiming she was not present, other times suggesting she was there but did not participate in the killings, and occasionally hinting that she was somehow forced or manipulated by Lacaze. These changing stories have found no support in the courts. Rogers Lacaze remained on death row until his execution was carried out on July 14, 2022, by lethal injection at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He maintained his guilt but showed little remorse during his final statements. Frank's execution date has been set and postponed multiple times due to legal challenges and Louisiana's struggles with obtaining lethal injection drugs. As of the latest records, she remains incarcerated awaiting execution. The Antoinette Frank case stands as one of the most egregious examples of police corruption and betrayal in American criminal justice history, a stark reminder that the badge and uniform do not automatically confer integrity or honor, and that the screening and oversight of law enforcement officers is a matter of life and death for the communities they serve. Number 3. Drew Walter Peterson. Drew Walter Peterson seemed to epitomize the confident, experienced police officer when he worked for the Bolingbrook Police Department in Illinois, rising to the rank of sergeant during his nearly 30-year career. But behind his badge and charm lurked a controlling, narcissistic personality that would ultimately lead to murder and the disappearance of multiple wives. Born on January 5, 1954, in Oak Park, Illinois, Peterson grew up in a working-class family and showed an early interest in law enforcement, joining the Bolingbrook Police Department in 1977 at the age of 23. He quickly established himself as a competent officer, working his way up through the ranks and earning commendations for his service. Peterson was known among his colleagues as confident to the point of arrogance, with a particular appeal to younger women who seemed drawn to his authority and assertive personality. He married his first wife, Carol Brown, in 1974, before he even joined the police force, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1980, with Carol later describing Peterson as controlling and emotionally abusive. In 1982, Peterson married his second wife, Vicki Connolly, with whom he had 2 children. This marriage lasted 10 years before ending in divorce in 1992, with Connolly also reporting that Peterson had been controlling and possessive, monitoring her activities and exhibiting jealous rages when she spoke to other men. Despite these troubling patterns, Peterson's career in law enforcement continued to flourish, and his reputation within the department remained largely untarnished. In 1992, shortly after his divorce from Connolly, Peterson met Kathleen Savio, a young accountant who worked at a local firm. Savio was intelligent, independent, and initially charmed by Peterson's confidence and status as a police sergeant. They married quickly, and Savio became Peterson's 3rd wife. The marriage produced 2 sons, and for several years the relationship appeared stable to outsiders. However, according to later testimony from Savio's friends and family, Peterson's controlling behavior intensified over time. He monitored Savio's phone calls, questioned her about her whereabouts, and became enraged when she expressed any independence. Savio confided to her sisters that Peterson had threatened her on multiple occasions, telling her that he could make her disappear and that his connections in law enforcement would ensure he was never caught. In 2001, while still married to Kathleen Savio, the 47-year-old Peterson began an affair with Stacy and Callis, a 17-year-old high school student he encountered while responding to a call at a hotel where she worked. The age difference and the fact that Stacy was still a minor did not deter Peterson, who pursued her aggressively. Within months, Peterson filed for divorce from Kathleen Savio and moved in with Stacy, who was now 18. The divorce proceedings between Peterson and Savio were contentious and bitter, with Savio repeatedly reporting to police that Peterson was threatening her and engaging in domestic violence. On multiple occasions between 2002 and 2004, Savio called 911 to report that Peterson had broken into her home, pushed her, or threatened her life. Police responded to these calls, but Peterson's colleagues in the Bolingbrook Police Department treated the incidents as domestic disputes rather than serious criminal matters. Fellow officers sometimes failed to file proper reports or investigate Savio's claims thoroughly, and Peterson faced no significant consequences for his behavior. Savio told friends and family that she feared Peterson would kill her, and that she was certain he would find a way to make it look like an accident. On March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found dead in her bathtub by neighbors who had become concerned when she failed to answer her door for several days. The bathtub was dry, and Savio's body showed a significant laceration to her head. The initial investigation was conducted by the Illinois State Police at the request of the Bolingbrook Police Department, which cited conflict of interest concerns given Peterson's employment there. However, the state police investigators who responded to the scene made a series of critical errors. They did not treat the death as suspicious despite the unusual circumstances of a woman drowning in a dry bathtub. They noted the head wound but accepted the theory that Savio had slipped and fallen, striking her head before drowning in bathwater that had subsequently drained. A coroner's jury, convened to determine the manner of death, ruled it an accidental drowning after hearing testimony from a pathologist who had not properly examined the scene or considered alternative explanations. Kathleen Savio's family was outraged by this conclusion, insisting that she had been murdered, but their protests were dismissed. Drew Peterson, as Savio's ex-husband, stood to gain financially from her death, as it resolved their ongoing property dispute and allowed him to claim benefits as her former spouse. He showed no apparent grief at her death and married Stacy Callis in October 2003, several months before Savio's death, when Stacy was just 19 years old. The marriage between Peterson and Stacy initially appeared happy to outsiders, but those close to Stacy reported that Peterson was even more controlling with her than he had been with his previous wives. He monitored her constantly, dictated what she could wear, isolated her from friends and family, and engaged in verbal abuse. By 2007, Stacy, now 23 years old and the mother of 2 young children with Peterson, confided to her pastor, Neil Scory, that she was desperately unhappy and wanted to leave the marriage. She told Reverend Scory something that would later become crucial to the investigation. She claimed that on the night Kathleen Savio died, Drew Peterson had woken her up in the early morning hours, dressed in black clothing and carrying a bag. He told her he needed her help, and together they drove to Savio's house. Peterson went inside while Stacy waited in the car, and when he returned, he was carrying the same bag, which now appeared heavy and contained women's clothing. Stacy said Peterson told her that he had helped Savio with a problem and warned her never to speak of that night to anyone. She said she later realized that this was the night Savio had died, and that Peterson had likely murdered her and staged the scene to look like an accident. Stacy Peterson told the pastor that she feared for her own life and was planning to leave Drew with the children. On October 28, 2007, Stacy Peterson disappeared. She was last seen by her husband, who claimed that she had called him around 9 p.m. that evening to tell him she was leaving him for another man and would be sending for her belongings later. Peterson told police that Stacy had abandoned him and their children to run off with another man, and he appeared on numerous television programs making this claim and portraying himself as the victim of an unfaithful wife. However, Stacy's family and friends immediately suspected foul play. Stacy had not taken her car, her purse, her cell phone, or any clothing with her. She had not made any of the arrangements one would expect from someone planning to leave, and she would never have abandoned her children, whom she adored. When police began investigating Stacy's disappearance, they discovered the information she had shared with her pastor about the night Kathleen Savio died, and the case exploded into a media sensation. The Illinois State Police reopened the investigation into Savio's death and exhumed her body for a new autopsy. The re-examination was conducted by Dr. Larry Blum, a forensic pathologist who had not been involved in the original investigation. Dr. Blum's findings directly contradicted the original conclusion. He determined that the laceration on Savio's head was inconsistent with a simple fall and that the bruising patterns on her body suggested she had been involved in a struggle. The dry bathtub and the position of the body indicated that Savio had not drowned in the conventional sense but had likely been held underwater or killed elsewhere and placed in the tub. Dr. Blum ruled Savio's death a homicide, not an accident. This finding transformed Drew Peterson from a man whose wife had conveniently died to a murder suspect. The media coverage of the Peterson case became intense, with national news programs covering every development. Peterson, rather than maintaining a low profile, gave numerous interviews in which he appeared smug and dismissive of the investigation. He made jokes about Stacy's disappearance, suggested she had run off with another man, and displayed a shocking lack of concern about either Stacy's fate or the suspicion falling on him regarding Kathleen Savio's death. This behavior only intensified public and law enforcement scrutiny. In May 2009, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Kathleen Savio. The case presented significant challenges for prosecutors because it was based largely on circumstantial evidence and the hearsay statements Stacy Peterson had made to her pastor before her disappearance. Illinois law generally prohibits hearsay testimony, but prosecutors successfully argued for the admission of Stacy's statements under a legal provision that allows hearsay when the defendant is believed to have caused the witness's unavailability. This became known as Drew's Law, legislation passed specifically to address situations where a defendant has silenced witnesses. Peterson's trial began in July 2012 and lasted nearly 2 months. Prosecutors presented evidence of Peterson's controlling behavior, his threats against Kathleen Savio, the suspicious circumstances of her death, and Stacy Peterson's statements about the night Savio died. They also presented testimony from Savio's family and friends about her fear of Peterson and her predictions that he would kill her. The defense argued that Savio's death had been ruled an accident by qualified investigators, and that the prosecution was simply trying to retry the case with a different result based on speculation. They challenged the hearsay evidence and argued that Peterson was being prosecuted in the court of public opinion rather than on solid legal grounds. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 3 days before returning a guilty verdict on September 6, 2012. Judge Edward Burmala sentenced Peterson to 38 years in prison, with Savio's family members delivering emotional victim impact statements about the devastating effect of her murder on their lives and the lives of her children. The conviction brought some measure of justice for Kathleen Savio, but Stacy Peterson's fate remained unknown. Her body has never been found, and despite extensive searches of areas where Peterson had access, no evidence of her final resting place has been discovered. In 2015, while serving his sentence for Savio's murder, Peterson was charged with solicitation of murder for hire. Federal prosecutors alleged that Peterson had attempted to hire a fellow inmate to kill James Glasgow, the state's attorney who had prosecuted him for Savio's murder. Peterson had allegedly offered $50,000 for the hit and provided detailed information about Glasgow's movements and home. He was convicted on this charge in 2016 and received an additional 40 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively with his state sentence, effectively ensuring he will die in prison. The Drew Peterson case exposed serious failures in how domestic violence reports were handled by law enforcement, particularly when the abuser was a fellow officer. Kathleen Savio's numerous calls to police had been treated as nuisance complaints rather than serious threats, and the initial investigation into her death was woefully inadequate. The case led to reforms in how police departments handle domestic violence allegations against their own officers and emphasized the importance of independent investigations in such cases. It also highlighted the need for thorough death investigations that consider all possibilities rather than accepting the most convenient explanation. The families of both Kathleen Savio and Stacey Peterson have never fully recovered from their losses, and Stacey's children have grown up without their mother, left with the knowledge that their father almost certainly killed her. Drew Peterson remains incarcerated at Terre Haute Federal Prison in Indiana, maintaining his innocence regarding Stacey's disappearance while serving his sentences for Savio's murder and the murder-for-hire plot. A fallen officer whose arrogance, narcissism, and violence destroyed multiple families and shattered the public trust in those sworn to protect and serve. Number 4. Manuel Pardo Jr. Manuel Pardo Jr. was a decorated police officer with the Miami Police Department who claimed to be cleaning up the streets by executing drug dealers. But his true motivation was far darker than vigilante justice. He was a serial killer who murdered 9 people in a 6-month rampage while still wearing the badge. Born on November 25, 1956, in New York City to Cuban immigrant parents, Pardo moved to Miami as a child and grew up immersed in the city's complex cultural landscape during a period of significant social change and rising crime. His father worked in construction while his mother maintained the household, and by all accounts, Pardo had an unremarkable childhood with no significant trauma or abuse that would explain his later actions. He was of average intelligence, performed adequately in school, and showed no early signs of violent tendencies. After graduating high school, Pardo enlisted in the United States Navy, where he served honorably for several years, receiving positive evaluations and training in weapons and tactical operations. Following his discharge, he returned to Miami and applied to the Miami Police Department in 1979, successfully completing the academy and beginning his career as a patrol officer. During his early years with the department, Pardo distinguished himself as an aggressive, proactive officer who actively sought out criminal activity and made numerous arrests. He worked primarily in high-crime areas of Miami where drug trafficking and violence were rampant during the height of the cocaine trade in the 1980s. Pardo received several commendations for his work, including letters of appreciation and awards for arrests that led to significant drug seizures and prosecutions. He was seen by supervisors as dedicated, perhaps overly aggressive at times, but committed to fighting crime. However, beneath this professional facade, Pardo was developing a dangerous obsession with power and a twisted ideology about justice. He began to see himself as above the law, as a crusader who was not bound by the constitutional protections afforded to criminals. He expressed frustration to fellow officers about the judicial system, complaining that drug dealers were arrested only to be released on bail or given light sentences, and he began to suggest that more permanent solutions were necessary. His colleagues dismissed these comments as the typical venting of a frustrated cop dealing with a broken system, not recognizing them as harbingers of something far more sinister. In 1985, Pardo's career took a significant downturn when he was involved in a controversial shooting incident. While off-duty, he discharged his weapon during an altercation, and the subsequent investigation raised questions about his judgment and temperament. Rather than face potential termination or criminal charges, Pardo resigned from the Miami Police Department in July 1985. The resignation was officially listed as voluntary, but it was clear that Pardo was being pushed out due to concerns about his conduct. For a man who had built his identity around being a police officer and who derived his sense of power from the badge, this loss was devastating. Unable to let go of his law enforcement identity, Pardo obtained employment as a security guard and continued to portray himself as a police officer, often wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons in a manner that suggested official status. He also obtained fraudulent police credentials and badges that he used to deceive people into believing he still had law enforcement authority. This impersonation would become central to his murder spree. Beginning in April 1986 and continuing through October 1986, Pardo embarked on a calculated series of murders targeting individuals involved in the drug trade in Miami. On April 14, 1986, Pardo killed his first victim, Daisy Ricard, a 25-year-old woman involved in low-level drug distribution, along with her associate, Ramon Alvaro. Pardo gained entry to their apartment by displaying a badge and claiming to be conducting a police investigation. Once inside, he forced both victims to the floor and executed them with a firearm, shooting each multiple times in the head at close range. He then ransacked the apartment, taking cash, drugs, and jewelry. 2 weeks later, on April 28, 1986, Pardo targeted Mario Amador and Roberto Alfonso, two men operating a drug distribution operation from a home in southwest Miami. Again using his false police credentials, Pardo entered the residence claiming to have a warrant, forced the men to lie face down, and executed them both with shots to the back of the head. He stole approximately $15,000 in cash and several kilograms of cocaine, which he later sold on the black market. The pattern continued on July 14, 1986, when Pardo murdered Luis Robledo and Ulpiano Lido at a known drug house. The execution-style killings were identical. Pardo presented himself as a police officer, gained control of the victims, forced them into vulnerable positions, and shot them in the head. He made off with more cash and drugs, which he converted into money to fund his lifestyle. On October 6, 1986, Pardo committed what would be his final double homicide, killing Farah Quintero and Farah Musa. The victims were involved in cocaine distribution and were targeted by Pardo using the same methodology that had proven successful in his previous killings. He identified their location through his knowledge of Miami's drug underworld, presented false police credentials to gain entry, executed both victims, and stole their money and narcotics. Throughout these 6 months, Miami police were investigating what they believed to be a series of drug-related murders, possibly the work of rival dealers or cartels eliminating competition. The execution-style nature of the killings and the fact that the victims were all involved in the drug trade suggested professional hits. Investigators did not initially suspect that a former police officer could be responsible, though some elements of the crime scenes suggested that the killer had law enforcement training, particularly in the efficient, methodical way the victims were controlled and killed. Pardo's downfall came through his own arrogance and sloppiness. He had kept detailed records of his murders, maintaining a diary in which he documented each killing with chilling precision. He described the murders as executions, referred to his victims as drug dealers who deserved to die, and portrayed himself as an avenging angel cleaning up Miami's streets. He also kept trophies from his victims, including jewelry, identification cards, and photographs, storing them in his apartment. When Pardo attempted to sell a distinctive piece of jewelry taken from one of his victims to a pawn shop, the pawnbroker noticed that the item matched descriptions of property stolen during one of the recent homicides and contacted police. Detectives traced the sale back to Pardo and obtained a warrant to search his residence. The search yielded overwhelming evidence: the diary detailing all 9 murders, property belonging to the victims, weapons that ballistics testing would later match to the murders, and the fraudulent police credentials Pardo had used to gain access to his victims. Pardo was arrested on October 7, 1986, and charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder. During interrogation, rather than deny the killings, Pardo confessed with disturbing pride. He insisted that he was not a murderer but an executioner who had rid society of dangerous criminals. He claimed that each victim had been involved in drug trafficking and that his actions were justified as a form of street justice that the official legal system was too weak to impose. He showed no remorse and instead seemed to expect recognition for his actions. Investigators discovered that Pardo's claimed motivation, that he was targeting drug dealers as a vigilante, was at least partially false. While his victims were indeed involved in the drug trade, Pardo's primary motivation appeared to be financial gain and the thrill of exercising power over life and death. The large amounts of cash and drugs he stole from his victims, which he used for his own benefit rather than destroying or turning over to authorities, contradicted his self-styled image as a crusader. Pardo's trial began in 1988 and was a media sensation in Miami. Prosecutors presented the diary, the physical evidence linking Pardo to the crime scenes, and testimony from witnesses who had seen Pardo with items belonging to the victims. Pardo's defense attorneys argued for a verdict of second-degree murder rather than first-degree, suggesting that Pardo suffered from mental illness and truly believed he was performing a public service by killing drug dealers. They presented psychiatric testimony suggesting that Pardo had developed a delusional disorder related to his law enforcement identity and his inability to accept his termination from the police department. The jury rejected this argument, finding Pardo guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder, and the trial moved to the penalty phase. During sentencing, prosecutors emphasized the premeditated, calculated nature of the murders, the vulnerability of the victims who believed they were dealing with a legitimate police officer, and Pardo's complete lack of remorse. The defense presented mitigating factors, including Pardo's naval service and his prior contributions as a police officer, but these paled in comparison to the brutality of his crimes. The jury recommended death, and Judge Roberto Martinez sentenced Manuel Pardo to death by electrocution, later modified to lethal injection when Florida changed its method of execution. Pardo spent 26 years on death row at Florida State Prison, where he continued to maintain that he was not a criminal but a victim of a corrupt system that failed to adequately punish drug dealers. He granted several interviews to journalists and researchers, during which he expressed no remorse for his victims, continued to justify his actions as necessary executions, and complained about his treatment in the criminal justice system. His appeals, which challenged the admissibility of evidence and argued that his mental state should have precluded a death sentence, were all denied by Florida courts. On December 11, 2012, Manuel Pardo was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. In his final statement, he did not apologize to the families of his victims or express any regret for his actions. Instead, he thanked his family for their support and maintained his innocence of any moral wrongdoing, stating that he had only eliminated drug dealers who were poisoning society. He was pronounced dead at 7:28 p.m., and his execution brought a measure of closure to the families of his 9 victims, though the pain of their losses remained. The Manuel Pardo case highlighted the extreme danger posed by individuals who abuse law enforcement authority and credentials to victimize others. His ability to gain access to victims by presenting himself as a police officer demonstrated how trust in the badge can be weaponized by those with malicious intent. The case also raised important questions about psychological screening for police officers and the need for ongoing mental health assessment throughout an officer's career. Pardo's development of a vigilante mentality and his inability to accept oversight or accountability were warning signs that were not adequately addressed by the Miami Police Department before his resignation. The victims of Manuel Pardo, while involved in illegal activity, were nevertheless entitled to due process and protection under the law, and Pardo's claim that he was performing a public service was thoroughly rejected by prosecutors, judges, and juries as the self-serving delusion of a power-hungry killer. The case remains a stark example of how those entrusted with enforcing the law can become its most dangerous violators when they convince themselves they are above the very system they once swore to uphold. Number 5. David Ray Cam. David Ray Cam appeared to be a model Indiana state trooper with a loving family when, on September 28, 2000, his wife and 2 children were found brutally murdered in the garage of their Georgetown, Indiana, home. But what followed was one of the most controversial and complex criminal cases in Indiana history, involving 3 trials, conflicting evidence, and questions about whether Cam was a murderer or the victim of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. Born on March 23, 1964, in New Albany, Indiana, David Cam grew up in a close-knit family with strong community ties. He was an accomplished athlete in high school, particularly excelling in basketball, and after graduation, he attended Indiana University Southeast. In 1989, at the age of 25, Cam joined the Indiana State Police, fulfilling what he described as a lifelong ambition to serve in law enforcement. He was assigned to the Sellersburg post and worked primarily in patrol and traffic enforcement. By all accounts, he was a dedicated officer who performed his duties competently and earned the respect of his supervisors and colleagues. In 1989, the same year he joined the state police, Cam married Kimberly Renee Howell, a vibrant young woman who worked as a secretary and was known for her warm personality and devotion to her family. The couple settled in Georgetown, a small town in southern Indiana, and soon started a family. Their son, Bradley, was born in 1991, followed by their daughter, Jill, in 1995. To those who knew them, the Camps appeared to be a typical, happy American family. David was seen coaching his son's basketball team, attending church regularly with his family, and maintaining an active social life. However, beneath this idyllic surface, there were tensions in the marriage that few outsiders recognized. On the evening of September 28, 2000, David Cam, who had recently left the Indiana State Police to take a job with his uncle's construction company, claimed he had gone to play basketball at a local church gymnasium with friends, as he did regularly on Thursday evenings. He said he arrived home around 9:30 p.m. to find the garage door open and his white Ford Bronco parked inside. When he entered the garage, he discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. His wife, Kim, age 35, was lying on the floor of the garage in a pool of blood, shot twice in the head and once in the chest at close range with a .380 caliber handgun. His 7-year-old daughter, Jill, was still in the back seat of the Bronco, shot in the head and chest, also dead. His 5-year-old son, Bradley, was lying on the floor of the vehicle, shot in the chest, also deceased. Cam immediately called 911, and his frantic call was recorded by dispatchers. When police arrived, Cam was visibly distraught, pacing in the driveway and hyperventilating. The crime scene was horrific, and investigators from the Indiana State Police and the Floyd County Sheriff's Department began processing the evidence. The initial investigation seemed to support Cam's account of arriving home to find his family murdered. There was no sign of forced entry to the house, suggesting the family had been attacked as they returned home and were still in or near the vehicle. The garage door was open, consistent with someone having just pulled in. There was no obvious motive for anyone to target the Cam family, and no suspects were immediately apparent. However, within days of the murders, the investigation took a dramatic turn when a blood spatter analyst examined David Cam's clothing from the night of the murders. The analyst, a retired police officer with training in blood pattern analysis, claimed to have identified microscopic blood spatter on Cam's t-shirt that was consistent with high-velocity impact spatter, the type created when a firearm is discharged at close range and blood particles are propelled back toward the shooter. The analyst concluded that this spatter proved Cam had been present when the shots were fired and had likely been the shooter. This finding, combined with suspicions about Cam's demeanor and timeline, led investigators to focus on him as the prime suspect. Detectives began to construct a theory that Cam had murdered his family, changed his clothes, and then gone to play basketball to establish an alibi before returning home to discover the bodies. On October 1, 2000, just 3 days after the murders, David Cam was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. The arrest shocked the community and divided public opinion. Many who knew Cam could not believe he was capable of such brutality, while others pointed to statistics showing that in family murders, the husband and father is often the perpetrator. The prosecution's case was built primarily on the blood spatter evidence, testimony about alleged marital problems between David and Kim Cam, and inconsistencies in Cam's statements to police. Prosecutors suggested that Cam had been having extramarital affairs and wanted out of his marriage, and that he saw murder as preferable to divorce, which would have cost him financially and damaged his reputation. They also pointed to behavior they characterized as suspicious, including Cam's quick remarriage after his acquittal in his first trial and his demeanor during police questioning. Cam's first trial began in March 2002 in Warwick County, Indiana, to which the case had been moved due to pretrial publicity. The prosecution's star witness was the blood spatter analyst who testified that the tiny droplets on Cam's shirt could only have gotten there if he was the shooter. Prosecutors also presented testimony from women who claimed to have had affairs with Cam, suggesting he had a motive to escape his marriage. The defense argued that Cam had a solid alibi, presenting testimony from 11 witnesses who had been playing basketball with him at the time the murders were believed to have occurred, covering a time frame that would have made it virtually impossible for him to have committed the crimes and arrived at the gymnasium when he did. The defense also challenged the blood spatter evidence, bringing in their own experts who testified that the stains on Cam's shirt could have been transfer stains from his attempt to help his family members after discovering them, not high-velocity impact spatter from the shooting. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of murder. Cam was sentenced to 195 years in prison, and the conviction appeared to close the case. However, the evidence that would ultimately exonerate him was already emerging. In 2005, advances in DNA technology allowed for more sophisticated testing of evidence from the crime scene. Swabs taken from Cam's body contained DNA from an unknown male, someone who was not David Cam and who had not been identified. This discovery led to the case being reopened, and the DNA was entered into the National CODIS database. In February 2005, the DNA was matched to Charles Boney, a convicted criminal with a history of violent offenses against women. Boney had been incarcerated for a 1989 attack on a woman in which he attempted to abduct her at knife point and assault her sexually. He had been released from prison in 2000, just months before the Cam murders, and had been living in the Louisville, Kentucky area, just across the Ohio River from Georgetown, Indiana. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Boney initially denied any involvement but eventually admitted to being at the Cam residence on the night of the murders. His story, however, was that David Cam had solicited his help in killing Cam and that he had been present but had not fired the shots that killed the family. This statement was immediately suspicious to investigators, as Boney had no known connection to David Cam and stood to gain nothing by helping him commit murder. Based on the new DNA evidence and serious questions about the blood spatter testimony from Cam's first trial, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned his conviction in August 2004 and ordered a new trial. At the second trial, which began in January 2006, prosecutors presented a modified theory. They now argued that both David Cam and Charles Boney had been involved in the murders, acting together in some form of conspiracy. Boney testified against Cam, claiming that Cam had approached him to help kill his wife and had promised to pay him. The defense systematically destroyed Boney's credibility, demonstrating that he had changed his story multiple times, that he had a documented history of violence against women, that his DNA was found on Cam's body and on a sweatshirt at the crime scene, and that there was no evidence of any prior contact between Boney and Cam. The defense also presented new expert testimony challenging the blood spatter evidence, with nationally recognized forensic experts testifying that the original analyst had misidentified transfer stains as impact spatter, a mistake that had led to a wrongful conviction. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury again convicted David Cam of murder in March 2006, apparently accepting the prosecution's theory that Cam and Boney had acted together. However, this conviction was also overturned on appeal in 2009 due to errors in the admission of evidence, specifically the trial court's decision to allow testimony about Cam's alleged extramarital affairs, which the appeals court ruled was prejudicial and not directly relevant to whether he had committed the murders. Charles Boney was tried separately and convicted in 2006 of murdering Kim, Brad, and Jill Cam, and was sentenced to 225 years in prison, where he remains today. David Cam's third trial began in August 2013, more than 12 years after the murders. This time, the prosecution was hampered by rulings that excluded much of the evidence they had relied upon in previous trials, including testimony about alleged affairs and certain aspects of the blood spatter evidence that had been thoroughly discredited by defense experts. The defense presented a clear, coherent timeline showing that Cam had been playing basketball when the murders occurred and could not have committed them, and they presented compelling evidence that Charles Boney, acting alone, had been the killer. Forensic evidence showed that a palm print on the Bronco belonged to Boney, that his DNA was found on Cam's clothing and body, and that the murder weapon, though never recovered, was consistent with a .380 caliber firearm that Boney had access to. After deliberating for just under 5 days, the jury returned not guilty verdicts on all 3 murder charges on October 24, 2013. David Cam, who had spent 13 years in prison for murders he did not commit, was finally freed. The courtroom erupted in emotion as Cam's family embraced him, while Cam's family members, who had believed throughout the trials that David was guilty, sat in stunned silence. The aftermath of the Cam case has been extensive and painful for all involved. David Cam has filed civil rights lawsuits against the police officers and prosecutors involved in his wrongful conviction, arguing that they engaged in misconduct by suppressing evidence favorable to the defense and relying on discredited forensic testimony. Some of these lawsuits have been settled while others continue to wind through the courts. Cam's family remains divided, with some members believing that David was involved despite his acquittal, while others have accepted that Charles Boney alone was responsible. The Floyd County Prosecutor's Office has faced intense criticism for its handling of the case and for pursuing 3 trials despite mounting evidence of Cam's innocence. The case has also led to reforms in how blood spatter evidence is presented in Indiana courts, with stricter requirements for expert qualifications and heightened scrutiny of such testimony. David Cam has struggled to rebuild his life after losing 13 years to wrongful imprisonment and suffering the loss of his wife and children. He has spoken publicly about his ordeal, advocating for criminal justice reform and better training for forensic analysts. The true perpetrator, Charles Boney, continues to maintain a version of events in which he was merely present but not the killer, despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and his conviction by a jury. The David Cam case stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision in criminal investigations, the potential for forensic evidence to be misinterpreted or misrepresented, and the devastating consequences when the presumption of innocence is abandoned in favor of a rush to judgment, particularly when the accused is a law enforcement officer whose training and background should have made investigators more careful, not less, in their pursuit of the truth. Number 6. Robert Ernest Rozier Jr. Robert Ernest Rozier Jr. seemed to have the world at his feet when he was drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals in the 9th round of the 1979 NFL Draft. A powerful defensive end from the University of California, Berkeley, but his professional football career lasted only 1 season before mental illness, religious extremism, and a descent into serial murder transformed him into one of the most unusual killers in American criminal history, a man who murdered for a racist cult and later became a protected government witness working in law enforcement. Born on July 28, 1955, in Anchorage, Alaska, Rozier grew up in a military family that moved frequently during his childhood. His father was a career serviceman, and the family eventually settled in California, where Rozier attended high school and excelled in athletics, particularly football. He was a standout player with exceptional size, strength, and speed, earning a scholarship to UC Berkeley, where he played defensive end for the Golden Bears. During his college years, Rozier was known as an intense, focused athlete, but some teammates and coaches noted that he could be volatile and difficult to coach, with mood swings and angry outbursts that seemed disproportionate to the situations that triggered them. Despite these concerns, his athletic talent was undeniable, and he was selected by the St. Louis Cardinals in 1979. However, Rozier's NFL career was brief and disappointing. He appeared in only a handful of games during the 1979 season before being released by the Cardinals. He had brief stints with several other teams but never made it back onto an active roster. The sudden end of his football dreams devastated Rozier, who had built his entire identity around being an elite athlete. Without the structure and purpose that football had provided, he began to spiral, experiencing what he would later describe as a mental breakdown. He moved back to California and drifted between various jobs, unable to find direction or meaning in his life. In 1981, while living in Los Angeles, Rozier encountered a group calling itself the Temple of Love, but which was more commonly known as Yahweh Ben Yahweh, a black Hebrew Israelite religious sect led by Hewlin Mitchell Jr., who had taken the name Yahweh Ben Yahweh, claiming to be the Son of God. The organization preached a doctrine of black supremacy and claimed that African Americans were the true chosen people of God, while white people were devils who needed to be destroyed or subjugated. The sect combined elements of Judaism, Christianity, and black nationalism into a toxic ideology that justified violence against non-believers and particularly against white people. Yahweh Ben Yahweh established a hierarchical organization with himself at the top, surrounded by an inner circle of devoted followers who called themselves the Brotherhood. Rozier, vulnerable and searching for purpose, was drawn to the group's message of black empowerment and the charismatic leadership of Yahweh Ben Yahweh. He joined the organization and quickly became a devoted member, eventually being inducted into the Brotherhood, the militant wing of the sect that carried out Yahweh's directives. To gain admission to the Brotherhood and prove his loyalty, members were required to kill a white devil and bring back a body part as proof. This grotesque initiation ritual was designed to bind members to the organization through shared guilt and to eliminate anyone who might have moral reservations about violence. In late 1983 and early 1984, Robert Rogier embarked on a killing spree in South Florida, where the Yahweh Ben Yahweh organization had established its headquarters. On January 12, 1984, Rogier approached Raymond Clark, a 72-year-old homeless white man, in the Liberty City neighborhood of Miami. Clark was sleeping on a park bench when Rogier attacked him, stabbing him repeatedly with a machete and killing him. Rogier then severed one of Clark's ears with the machete and brought it back to the temple as proof of his kill, presenting it to Yahweh Ben Yahweh and being celebrated by other Brotherhood members for his loyalty and courage. Rogier's bloodlust, now unleashed, did not stop with a single murder. Over the next several weeks, he killed 6 more people in the Miami area, targeting primarily homeless individuals and vulnerable victims who would not be immediately missed. On February 14, 1984, he murdered Charles Brown, a 49-year-old homeless man, stabbing him to death in a similar manner to his first victim. On March 17, 1984, he killed Anthony Mixon, 38, another homeless individual. The murders continued with increasingly brutal efficiency. Frank Majors, 36, was killed on April 19, 1984. Carlton Carey, 39, was murdered on May 26, 1984, and Ethel Williams, 46, became Rogier's only female victim when he stabbed her to death on June 30, 1984. His final confirmed victim was Robert Lyle Bell, 51, killed on October 12, 1984. In each case, Rogier used similar methods. He would identify vulnerable victims in isolated areas, approach them without warning, and attack with overwhelming violence using bladed weapons. He often mutilated the bodies after death, taking ears or other body parts as trophies to present to the temple leadership. The murders terrorized Miami's homeless population, but because the victims were marginalized individuals with limited connections to the community, the investigation moved slowly and the killings did not initially receive significant media attention. Rogier's downfall came not from the murder investigations but from his own instability and conflicts within the Yahweh organization. After a dispute with other members of the Brotherhood, Rogier fled Florida and eventually made his way to New York, where he was living under an assumed name. In 1986, facing pressure from ongoing federal investigations into the Yahweh organization for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy, Rogier made a calculated decision. He contacted federal authorities and offered to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He confessed to the 7 murders he had committed in Miami and provided detailed information about the inner workings of the Yahweh Ben Yahweh organization, including evidence that Hewlin Mitchell had directly ordered murders and had overseen a criminal enterprise involving extortion, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. The federal government, eager to dismantle the Yahweh organization and prosecute its leadership, made a controversial deal with Rogier. In exchange for his testimony against Yahweh Ben Yahweh and 14 other members of the organization, Rogier pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and received a sentence of just 22 years in prison, an astonishingly lenient punishment for a serial killer who had murdered 7 people. The deal sparked outrage among victims' families and the public, but federal prosecutors defended it as necessary to secure convictions against the organization's leadership, who they argued were responsible for orchestrating numerous crimes beyond Rogier's individual murders. Rogier served only 10 years of his already reduced sentence before being released from federal prison in 1996 as part of his cooperation agreement with the government. Upon release, he entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, receiving a new identity and being relocated to California. In an even more shocking development, Rogier managed to obtain employment as a deputy sheriff with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Despite his conviction for multiple murders, he concealed his criminal history during the application process, using his new identity and apparently exploiting gaps in background check procedures that failed to discover his past. He worked as a deputy for several months before his true identity was discovered by investigative journalists who were researching the Yahweh organization. When confronted with the revelation that they had hired a convicted serial killer, the Orange County Sheriff's Department immediately terminated Rogier and launched an internal investigation into how their vetting process had failed so catastrophically. The scandal was a massive embarrassment for the department and led to significant reforms in how background checks were conducted for law enforcement applicants. Robert Rogier's brief career as a deputy sheriff, while limited in scope, demonstrated the terrifying possibility that even convicted killers could infiltrate law enforcement if proper safeguards were not in place. After his termination from the sheriff's department, Rogier attempted to maintain a low profile, but his cooperation with federal authorities continued to haunt him. Members of the disbanded Yahweh organization, many of whom had been convicted and imprisoned based on his testimony, harbored deep resentment toward him, and there were credible threats against his life. Rogier violated the terms of his witness protection agreement multiple times, moving without authorization and contacting people from his past, which led to further complications with federal authorities. In 1999, Rogier's past caught up with him once again when he was arrested for check fraud, writing bad checks to purchase items using one of his assumed identities. The arrest led to the revocation of his supervised release from his original murder convictions, and he was returned to federal prison. In 2003, while still in custody, he pleaded guilty to the check fraud charges and received an additional sentence. The courts also revisited his original cooperation agreement, with some victims' families arguing that Rogier had violated its terms and should serve the remainder of his original sentence. In 2006, at the age of 51, Robert Rogier died in federal custody at a prison medical facility. The official cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia, though some sources suggest he had been suffering from various health problems in the years before his death. His passing went largely unnoticed by the public, meriting only brief mentions in news reports that focused more on his bizarre life story than on his death. The victims of his murder spree had been largely forgotten by everyone except their families, and Rogier's death brought no real closure or justice for them. The Yahweh Ben Yahweh organization, which Rogier had helped to expose and dismantle through his testimony, had already been destroyed by federal prosecutions in the early 1990s. Hewlin Mitchell, the leader who had called himself Yahweh Ben Yahweh, was convicted in 1992 on racketeering and conspiracy charges related to 14 murders committed by members of the organization. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and died in 2007, still maintaining his innocence and claiming to be a persecuted religious leader rather than a crime boss. The Robert Rogier case raises profound and disturbing questions about the criminal justice system's use of cooperation agreements with violent offenders. While prosecutors argue that such deals are sometimes necessary to prosecute larger criminal enterprises, critics point to Rogier as an example of the system gone horribly wrong. A serial killer who murdered 7 people and served only 10 years before being released and even allowed to work in law enforcement. The failure of background check systems that allowed Rogier to become a deputy sheriff highlights the need for more comprehensive vetting procedures and better information sharing between federal and local agencies. The case also illustrates the dangerous intersection of mental illness, religious extremism, and violence, as Rogier's descent from professional athlete to cult member to serial killer was facilitated by his psychological vulnerabilities and the exploitative ideology of the Yahweh organization. The victims of Robert Rogier, mostly homeless and marginalized individuals, were denied justice by a system that valued their killer's testimony more than their lives, and their deaths serve as a reminder that society's most vulnerable members are often its most forgotten when crimes against them are weighed against prosecutorial priorities and political considerations. Number 7. Lori Bembenek. Lori Bembenek was a young, ambitious Milwaukee police officer whose career ended in scandal and whose life became a decades-long nightmare of accusations, trials, imprisonment, and flight after she was convicted of murdering her husband's ex-wife in a case that divided public opinion and raised serious questions about police misconduct and wrongful conviction. Born Laurencia Bembenek on August 15, 1958, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, she grew up in a working-class Polish-American family as the youngest of 6 children. Her father was a carpenter and her mother a homemaker, and by all accounts, Lori had a normal, happy childhood. She was an attractive, intelligent young woman who excelled in school and developed an interest in law enforcement at an early age, inspired by television shows and a desire to help her community. After graduating from high school in 1976, Bembenek attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she studied criminal justice and worked various jobs to support herself through college. In 1980, at the age of 22, She achieved her dream of becoming a police officer when she was hired by the Milwaukee Police Department, one of only a handful of women on the force at that time. She was assigned to the 2nd District and began working patrol. However, Bembenek's career with the Milwaukee Police Department was troubled from the start. She quickly became disillusioned with the culture of the department, which she found to be sexist, corrupt, and resistant to reform. She filed complaints about male officers who made sexual advances toward her and about supervisors who treated female officers as inferior. She also reported witnessing what she believed to be corrupt practices, including officers accepting bribes and falsifying reports. These complaints made her extremely unpopular with her fellow officers and supervisors, who viewed her as a troublemaker and a threat to the department's internal cohesion. In retaliation for her complaints, Bembenek was subjected to harassment and negative performance evaluations that she believed were unwarranted and designed to force her out of the department. In 1981, after just over a year on the force, Bembenek was fired by the Milwaukee Police Department. The official reason given was that she had lied on her application about having smoked marijuana in the past. But Bembenek and her supporters argued that this was a pretext and that she was actually being punished for speaking out about corruption and discrimination. The dismissal was devastating to Bembenek, who had invested her hopes and identity in her law enforcement career. She filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the department, which was ultimately unsuccessful, and she struggled to find new employment. During this difficult period, she took a job as a waitress at a club frequented by Milwaukee police officers and met Frederick Schultz, a detective with the department who was recently divorced. Schultz was 17 years older than Bembenek and had 2 sons from his previous marriage to Christine Schultz. Frederick and Lori began dating, and despite the significant age difference and Fred's complicated personal situation, they married in January 1981, just months after meeting. The marriage was troubled from the beginning, with financial stress being a major source of conflict. Fred was required to pay significant child support and alimony to his ex-wife Christine, which left the couple struggling financially. Lori resented the payments and the hold that Christine seemed to have over their finances and their lives. According to later testimony, Lori made statements to friends expressing anger toward Christine and frustration that they would never have financial security as long as Fred had to support his ex-wife. On May 28, 1981, in the early morning hours, Christine Schultz, age 30, was murdered in her Milwaukee home while her 2 sons, aged 7 and 11, slept in another room. The killer entered through a window, confronted Christine in her bedroom, and shot her once in the back with a .38 caliber handgun, killing her. Her 11-year-old son, Sean, heard the commotion and entered his mother's room, where he encountered the intruder. Sean later told police that he saw a woman with long blonde hair wearing a green jogging suit who tied him up with rope before fleeing the scene. Police responded to the scene and began investigating the murder. Suspicion immediately fell on Frederick Schultz and his new wife Lori. Fred had a clear motive. Christine's death meant he would no longer have to pay child support or alimony, and he would gain custody of his sons. Lori also had motive, as she had expressed resentment toward Christine and stood to benefit financially from her death. Investigators discovered several pieces of circumstantial evidence linking Lori to the crime. A brown wig with long hair similar to what Sean described was found in the plumbing of the apartment building where Lori and Fred lived, suggesting someone had tried to dispose of it by flushing it down a toilet. A green jogging suit matching the description Sean provided was found in Lori's possession. Rope similar to that used to tie up Sean was also found in the couple's apartment. Most damningly, ballistics tests suggested that the bullet that killed Christine had been fired from Fred's off-duty service revolver, a .38 caliber weapon that was in the couple's possession. On June 24, 1981, less than a month after the murder, Lori Bembenek was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Fred Schultz was not charged, though he remained under suspicion. The case became a media sensation, with Lori's photogenic appearance and her claims of being framed by the Milwaukee Police Department in retaliation for her earlier complaints, making her a sympathetic figure to many observers. Supporters rallied around her, creating Run, Bambi, Run t-shirts and bumper stickers, playing on her childhood nickname. Her trial began in February 1982, and the prosecution presented the circumstantial evidence linking her to the crime, along with testimony about her financial motive and her expressed animosity toward Christine. The most powerful testimony came from Sean Schultz, who identified Lori as resembling the woman he had seen in his mother's bedroom, though his identification was not absolute and he acknowledged uncertainties. The defense argued that Lori was being framed, either by corrupt police officers who wanted revenge for her earlier complaints or possibly by Fred Schultz himself, who had the strongest motive for wanting his ex-wife dead. They challenged the reliability of Sean's identification, noting that he had been traumatized and had seen the intruder only briefly in dim lighting. They also raised questions about how thoroughly police had investigated other potential suspects. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury convicted Lori Bembenek of first-degree murder on March 9, 1982, and Judge Michael Squirowski sentenced her to life in prison. Bembenek maintained her innocence and immediately began appealing her conviction while serving her sentence at the Taycheedah Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. For the next 8 years, Bembenek pursued every legal avenue available to overturn her conviction, arguing that she had received ineffective assistance of counsel, that evidence had been improperly admitted, and that police had engaged in misconduct during the investigation. All of her appeals were denied by Wisconsin courts. Frustrated by the legal system and increasingly desperate, Bembenek took a drastic step. On July 15, 1990, she escaped from Taycheedah Correctional Institution with the help of Dominic Gugliatto, her fiancé whom she had met through prison correspondence. Gugliatto provided Bembenek with tools to cut through a window screen and a laundry cart to hide in as she was smuggled out of the prison. The escape made national headlines and turned Bembenek into a folk hero for some who saw her as a wrongfully convicted woman forced to take matters into her own hands. Bembenek and Gugliatto fled to Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, where they lived under assumed names for 3 months. Bembenek worked as a waitress and tried to build support for her case through media appearances, granting interviews to Canadian journalists in which she proclaimed her innocence and detailed what she claimed were irregularities in her trial. However, Canadian authorities, working with American law enforcement and using tips from the public who recognized Bembenek from news coverage, located her in October 1990. She was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and held pending extradition back to the United States. Her capture ended her brief period of freedom but also brought renewed attention to her case. The legal proceedings following her capture became extraordinarily complex. Bembenek fought extradition, arguing that she would not receive a fair hearing if returned to Wisconsin. Canadian courts ultimately ordered her extradition, and she was returned to Wisconsin custody in late 1990. Rather than face additional charges for escape and a continuation of her life sentence, Bembenek's attorneys negotiated a plea agreement with Wisconsin prosecutors. In a highly unusual arrangement, Bembenek agreed to plead no contest to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of time served, which would result in her immediate release. The plea allowed her to maintain that she had not admitted guilt while the state secured a conviction that would end the case. On December 9, 1992, Lori Bembenek was released from prison after serving 10 years. The terms of her plea agreement required that she not profit from her story for a certain period, but after that restriction expired, she pursued various opportunities to tell her version of events. She wrote a book titled Woman on Trial and appeared on numerous television programs, always maintaining that she had been wrongfully convicted and that the real killer had never been found. She also pursued a civil lawsuit against the Milwaukee Police Department and various individuals she claimed had conspired to frame her, though these lawsuits were ultimately unsuccessful. Bembenek's post-prison life was difficult and marked by continued controversy. She struggled with substance abuse issues and had various legal problems, including arrests for violations of parole conditions. She worked various jobs, never able to establish the stable, successful life she had once imagined. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, she continued to advocate for her innocence, and some evidence emerged that seemed to support her claims. Questions were raised about the handling of physical evidence, including allegations that police had failed to properly test certain items and had not fully investigated alternative suspects. Some forensic experts who reviewed the case suggested that the ballistics evidence linking Fred Schultz's gun to the murder was not as definitive as the prosecution had claimed. In 2002, Bembenek's attorneys filed a motion seeking to have her conviction vacated based on new evidence, but the motion was denied by Wisconsin courts. By this time, Bembenek was living in the Pacific Northwest, trying to maintain privacy and distance herself from the notoriety of her case. She had ongoing health problems, including issues related to hepatitis C that she had contracted during her time in prison. In 2009, Bembenek suffered a serious accident when she fell and hit her head, resulting in traumatic brain injury and other complications. She never fully recovered from these injuries. Lori Bembenek died on November 20, 2010, at the age of 52, in a hospice facility in Portland, Oregon, from complications related to liver and kidney failure. Her death brought renewed media attention to her case, with obituaries and retrospectives debating whether she had been a wrongfully convicted innocent woman or a murderer who had successfully manipulated public opinion. The truth of what happened on May 28, 1981, remains disputed to this day. Those who believe in Bembenek's innocence point to the circumstantial nature of the evidence against her, the inconsistencies in the eyewitness testimony, and the questions about police conduct in the investigation. They argue that she was railroaded by a corrupt police department that wanted revenge for her earlier complaints and that Fred Schultz, who had the strongest motive, was never properly investigated. Those who believe in her guilt point to the physical evidence found in her possession, her financial motive, and the testimony identifying her as the intruder. They argue that her escape from prison and her years of attempts to manipulate public opinion through media appearances demonstrated a consciousness of guilt rather than the actions of an innocent woman. The Christine Schultz murder case and the prosecution of Lori Bembenek exposed serious problems in the Milwaukee Police Department's culture during the 1980s, including sexism, resistance to accountability, and questions about investigative practices. Whether Bembenek was a victim of that culture or a beneficiary of public sympathy despite genuine guilt remains one of the most controversial questions in Wisconsin criminal justice history. The case also highlighted the dangers of celebrity and public opinion in criminal cases, as Bembenek's attractive appearance and media savvy created a narrative that may have obscured rather than illuminated the truth. Today, the case remains officially closed with Bembenek's no contest plea standing as the final resolution. But for many who have studied the evidence and the circumstances, the questions of guilt, innocence, and justice remain frustratingly unresolved. A reminder that not every criminal case ends with clarity or certainty, regardless of how many trials, appeals, and years of scrutiny are applied to it. Number 8. Christopher Jordan Dorner. Christopher Jordan Dorner was a former Los Angeles Police Department officer and Navy veteran who, in February 2013, embarked on a revenge-fueled killing spree that terrorized Southern California, murdered 4 people, and ended in a fiery standoff with police after he published a manifesto declaring war on the LAPD for what he claimed was an unjust termination and systemic racism within the department. Born on June 4, 1979, in New York, Dorner grew up in Southern California and was raised primarily by his mother after his parents separated. He was described by those who knew him as intelligent, articulate, and driven, with a strong sense of justice and fairness that sometimes manifested as rigidity and an inability to compromise. Dorner excelled academically and athletically in high school, earning a football scholarship to Southern Utah University, where he studied political science and played as a defensive back. After college, Dorner joined the United States Navy Reserve in 2002, undergoing training and eventually serving as a naval flight officer, receiving commendations for his service and deployment to Bahrain during the Iraq War. While maintaining his Navy Reserve commitment, Dorner pursued his goal of becoming a police officer, applying to the Los Angeles Police Department in 2005. He was accepted into the LAPD Academy and graduated in February 2006, beginning his career as a probationary officer. Dorner was initially assigned to patrol duties and was partnered with more experienced officers as part of the standard training protocol for new LAPD officers. By most accounts, Dorner was competent but sometimes difficult to work with, displaying a tendency to be argumentative and overly critical of procedures and fellow officers. In July 2007, an incident occurred that would set in motion the events leading to Dorner's eventual rampage. Dorner and his training officer, Sergeant Teresa Evans, were involved in an encounter with Christopher Gettler, a mentally ill man at a hotel in San Pedro. According to the official report, Evans kicked Gettler twice during the arrest to subdue him, an action that Gettler's father later complained about to the department. Dorner did not report the alleged use of excessive force at the time of the incident but waited 2 weeks before filing a complaint against Evans, claiming she had kicked Gettler multiple times in the face and chest while Gettler was handcuffed and offering no resistance. The complaint triggered an internal investigation by the LAPD's Internal Affairs Division. Evans vehemently denied Dorner's allegations, stating that she had used a leg sweep to control Gettler but had not kicked him repeatedly or used excessive force. Gettler and his father gave statements that contradicted Dorner's account, with Gettler stating that he did not recall being kicked in the manner Dorner described. Other witnesses at the scene also did not corroborate Dorner's version of events. After a thorough investigation, the Board of Rights, a panel that adjudicates LAPD disciplinary matters, concluded that Dorner had lied about the incident and that his complaint against Evans was false. The board determined that Dorner had fabricated the excessive force allegation either out of malice toward Evans, with whom he had a contentious working relationship, or as a retaliatory measure after receiving negative performance evaluations. In September 2008, the Board of Rights voted to terminate Dorner's employment with the LAPD for making false statements, a decision that devastated him. Dorner appealed the termination through every available channel, including filing lawsuits and petitions claiming that he had been wrongfully terminated for reporting misconduct and that the LAPD had engaged in a cover-up to protect Evans. He argued that the department was riddled with corruption and racism, and that his termination was retaliation for attempting to hold an officer accountable for brutality. All of his appeals were denied, and his employment termination was upheld by the courts. The loss of his law enforcement career consumed Dorner with bitterness and rage. Over the next several years, he became increasingly isolated and fixated on what he perceived as the injustice done to him by the LAPD. He continued his service in the Navy Reserve until 2013, when he was honorably discharged, and he worked various security and private investigation jobs, but he never recovered emotionally from his termination. He believed that his life had been destroyed by the LAPD's refusal to acknowledge the truth of his allegations, and he developed an elaborate conspiracy theory in which powerful forces within the department had orchestrated his downfall to protect their own corruption. On February 3, 2013, Dorner uploaded a lengthy manifesto to his Facebook page, a rambling 11-page document that laid out his grievances against the LAPD, named specific individuals he held responsible for his termination, and declared his intention to wage asymmetrical warfare against the department and the families of those who had wronged him. The manifesto was a chilling mixture of legitimate criticisms of police culture, personal grievances, political statements, and direct threats of violence. Dorner wrote that he would target not only LAPD officers but also their families, stating that he wanted those responsible for his termination to feel the pain of losing loved ones just as he had lost his career and reputation. He specifically named Randall Quan, a former LAPD captain who had represented Dorner during his Board of Rights hearing, as someone who would be held accountable. On the evening of February 3, 2013, just hours after posting his manifesto, Dorner murdered Monica Quan, the 27-year-old daughter of Randall Quan, and her fiancé, Keith Lawrence, 27, in the parking structure of their condominium complex in Irvine, California. Both victims were shot multiple times in what police would later describe as an ambush. Monica Quan was a basketball coach at California State University, Fullerton, and Keith Lawrence was a campus safety officer at the University of Southern California. Neither had any connection to Dorner beyond Monica's relationship to Randall Quan, and their murders were acts of pure revenge designed to inflict maximum emotional suffering on Quan. When police discovered the bodies and read Dorner's manifesto, they immediately realized they were dealing with a highly trained, heavily armed former police officer and military veteran who had declared war on the LAPD and had already demonstrated his willingness to kill innocent people. The department issued a department-wide tactical alert, warning all officers that they were potential targets and advising them to take extraordinary security precautions. Officers were provided with security details for their homes, and many moved their families to secure locations. On February 7, 2013, Dorner struck again. He ambushed 2 Riverside Police Department officers who were stopped at a red light in their patrol car. Dorner pulled up alongside the police vehicle in a pickup truck and opened fire with a rifle, shooting through the passenger window. Officer Michael Crane, 34, an 11-year veteran of the department and married father of two, was killed instantly by multiple gunshot wounds. His partner, Officer Andrew Takias, was seriously wounded but survived. Dorner then fled the scene, initiating a massive manhunt involving multiple law enforcement agencies across Southern California. Less than 30 minutes after the Riverside shooting, Dorner attempted to steal a boat from an elderly couple at a marina in San Diego, planning to flee to Mexico by sea. However, the boat became entangled in a rope and would not start properly. Dorner abandoned the attempt and fled in the truck he had been driving, which was later discovered abandoned in San Diego. Inside the vehicle, police found weapons, tactical gear, and a wallet containing Dorner's LAPD badge and identification card, which he had apparently discarded symbolically. The manhunt for Dorner became one of the largest in California history, with thousands of law enforcement officers from local, state, and federal agencies participating in the search. Police believe Dorner was hiding in the mountains of San Bernardino County, where he had previously owned property and was familiar with the terrain. The search involved helicopters, SWAT teams, bloodhounds, and door-to-door searches of mountain communities. The manhunt was marked by tragic errors and heightened tensions. On February 7, 2013, LAPD officers guarding the home of a person named in Dorner's manifesto mistook a blue Toyota Tacoma driven by two Hispanic women delivering newspapers for Dorner's vehicle, which was also described as a blue truck. The officers opened fire on the vehicle without warning, shooting more than 100 rounds and seriously wounding both women, Emma Hernandez, 71, and her daughter Margie Carranza, 47. The shooting was a catastrophic failure of judgment that demonstrated the extreme fear and tension among officers during the manhunt. A short time later, Torrance police officers in a separate incident shot at another vehicle they mistakenly believed was connected to Dorner, though the occupant was not injured. These incidents raised serious questions about officer training and discipline during high-stress situations. For several days, Dorner's location remained unknown, and police received hundreds of reported sightings from across California and neighboring states. On February 12, 2013, the search finally came to an end when Dorner broke into a cabin near Big Bear Lake and tied up the owners, Jim and Karen Reynolds, who had arrived at their vacation property. Dorner held them briefly before allowing them to leave unharmed, taking their vehicle and fleeing. The Reynoldses immediately contacted police, and within hours, officers spotted Dorner driving the stolen vehicle on a mountain road. Dorner crashed the vehicle and fled on foot into the forest, exchanging gunfire with pursuing officers. He ran to another cabin and barricaded himself inside. Law enforcement surrounded the cabin and a protracted gun battle ensued. Dorner fired hundreds of rounds at officers from inside the cabin, and police returned fire while attempting to negotiate his surrender. During the firefight, two San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies were shot. Detective Jeremiah McKay, 35, a 15-year veteran and married father of two children and stepfather to two more, was shot in the head and killed, becoming Dorner's fourth and final murder victim. Detective Alex Collins was seriously wounded but survived after emergency surgery. As the standoff continued into the afternoon, police deployed tear gas canisters into the cabin in an attempt to force Dorner out. The canisters, which are pyrotechnic devices that generate heat, ignited a fire inside the wooden structure. The cabin quickly became engulfed in flames, and despite the intensity of the fire, Dorner did not emerge or attempt to surrender. Police maintained their perimeter as the cabin burned completely, collapsing in on itself. When the fire had cooled sufficiently for investigators to enter, they discovered human remains inside that were later identified through dental records as Christopher Dorner. The coroner determined that Dorner had died from a single, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, ending his life as police closed in on him. The discovery of Dorner's body brought relief to the thousands of law enforcement officers and their families who had been living in fear of becoming his next target. However, the aftermath of the Dorner case was complex and controversial. Some individuals, particularly in certain online communities and among those critical of police, lionized Dorner as a whistleblower who had been pushed too far by a corrupt system, ignoring or minimizing the fact that he had murdered 4 innocent people and attempted to kill many more. This disturbing romanticization of a mass murderer sparked debates about police accountability, media responsibility, and the danger of creating folk heroes out of killers. The LAPD conducted an extensive review of Dorner's case and his allegations against Teresa Evans, ultimately reaffirming that his termination had been justified and that his complaints were false. However, the department also acknowledged that the case had revealed ongoing concerns about how the LAPD handles complaints of excessive force and internal whistleblower protections. Police Chief Charlie Beck promised reforms to improve the complaint process and to ensure that officers who report misconduct are protected from retaliation. The families of Dorner's victims were left to cope with unimaginable grief. Randall Kwan had to live with the knowledge that his daughter and her fiancé had been murdered specifically to punish him for his role in Dorner's termination proceedings. The families of Michael Crane and Jeremiah McKay lost husbands and fathers who were simply doing their jobs, protecting their communities when they were murdered by a man consumed by revenge and delusion. The city of Los Angeles ultimately settled lawsuits filed by the two newspaper delivery women who were shot by LAPD officers, paying millions of dollars in compensation for the unjustified attack on them. The settlements highlighted the danger and chaos that Dorner's rampage had created and the tragic errors that resulted from the heightened fear among law enforcement. Christopher Dorner's 11-day reign of terror left 4 dead, multiple wounded, and a region traumatized by the actions of a man who claimed to be seeking justice but who was actually pursuing nothing more than murderous revenge against those he blamed for his failures. A former officer who became the very thing he claimed to be fighting against, and whose manifesto of grievances, however legitimate some of the underlying concerns about police culture might have been, could never justify or explain the cold-blooded murder of innocent people who had done him no wrong. Number 9. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. spent years hunting a phantom, or so it seemed to the terrified communities across California that lived in fear of the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker during the 1970s and 1980s, never knowing that one of the police officers working some of these very cases was himself a serial rapist and murderer whose crimes would eventually be linked to at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries spanning a decade of terror. Born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, DeAngelo grew up in a military family, as his father was a United States Air Force sergeant stationed at various bases during DeAngelo's childhood. The family lived in Germany for a period during DeAngelo's youth, and according to later investigations, DeAngelo witnessed a traumatic event during this time. His sister was allegedly raped by 2 airmen, an incident that some psychologists have speculated might have had a profound impact on his psychological development, though DeAngelo himself never confirmed this and its relevance to his later crimes remains speculative. The family eventually returned to the United States and settled in California, where DeAngelo attended high school and proved to be an unremarkable student. After graduating, he enrolled at Sierra College in Rocklin, California, studying criminal justice with the goal of pursuing a career in law enforcement. He also served in the United States Navy from 1964 to 1967, including a deployment to Vietnam, where he served honorably and received several commendations. After his discharge, DeAngelo returned to California and completed his education, earning an associate degree in police science. In 1973, DeAngelo was hired by the Exeter Police Department, a small agency in Tulare County in California's Central Valley. He worked as a police officer in Exeter from 1973 to 1976, during which time he married Sharon Huddle, a fellow college student he had met at Sierra College. To colleagues and neighbors, DeAngelo appeared to be a dedicated, if somewhat intense, police officer. He was known for being meticulous and for taking his job seriously, though some co-workers found him to be aloof and difficult to get to know personally. What no one knew was that during this same period, DeAngelo had begun a secret and horrifying second life as a serial rapist. Beginning in June 1976, a series of brutal home invasion rapes began to terrorize communities in Sacramento County and the surrounding areas of Northern California. The perpetrator, who became known as the East Area Rapist, demonstrated a terrifying level of preparation and sophistication in his attacks. He would surveil neighborhoods for weeks or even months before striking, identifying victims and learning their routines, their floor plans, and the locations of entry points to their homes. He often prowled neighborhoods at night, looking through windows and testing doors and locks, sometimes breaking into homes when residents were away to unlock windows or disable locks in preparation for future attacks. When he struck, typically in the middle of the night, the East Area Rapist would enter homes stealthily, often through windows or sliding glass doors that he had previously unlocked. He would awaken victims by shining a flashlight in their faces and threatening them with a gun or a knife, ordering them to remain silent on threat of death. In cases where couples were present, he would force the male victim to lie face down while he tied his hands behind his back, often stacking dishes or other objects on the man's back and warning that if he heard the dishes fall, he would kill everyone in the house. He would then take the female victim to another room where he would rape her, sometimes multiple times over the course of several hours, often returning to check on and threaten the male victim or other family members. He was known to sob or cry during attacks, and he made bizarre statements to his victims, sometimes claiming that he needed money for a sick relative or that he was taking revenge on someone named Bonnie who had wronged him. The psychological terror he inflicted went far beyond the physical sexual assaults, as victims reported feeling that he enjoyed the power and control as much as or more than the sexual acts themselves. Between 1976 and 1979, the East Area Rapist committed at least 50 rapes across multiple jurisdictions in the Sacramento area, including Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and other communities. Police from various agencies worked to identify and capture the perpetrator, but he seemed to always be one step ahead of law enforcement. He varied his patterns enough to avoid establishing a predictable routine. He wore gloves and a mask to avoid leaving fingerprints or being identified, and he frequently changed his modus operandi in small ways that made it difficult to anticipate his next move. Investigators collected what physical evidence they could, including DNA samples from rape kits, but DNA technology in the late 1970s was in its infancy and was not yet useful for identifying perpetrators from crime scene evidence. What makes Joseph DeAngelo's crimes even more shocking is that during the height of the East Area Rapist attacks, he was not just a police officer. He was actively working in law enforcement in the very region where the crimes were occurring. In 1976, DeAngelo left the Exeter Police Department and was hired by the Auburn Police Department in Placer County, just northeast of Sacramento, placing him in close proximity to many of the communities being terrorized by the rapist he actually was. As an Auburn police officer, DeAngelo would have had access to police reports, investigative information, and tactical knowledge about how law enforcement was attempting to catch the East Area Rapist, allowing him to stay ahead of the investigation into his own crimes. He could monitor police activities, know when patrols were increased in certain neighborhoods, and adjust his tactics accordingly. DeAngelo worked for the Auburn Police Department from 1976 until 1979, and during this time, the East Area Rapist attacks continued with increasing frequency and brutality. However, DeAngelo's law enforcement career came to an abrupt end in 1979 when he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a store in Auburn. The theft was incredibly brazen for a police officer and seemed almost suicidal from a career perspective, leading some later analysts to speculate that DeAngelo may have been subconsciously trying to get caught or was experiencing some form of psychological breakdown. He was arrested, convicted of the shoplifting charge, and fired from the Auburn Police Department in disgrace. The end of his law enforcement career might have been expected to end the East Area Rapist attacks as well, but instead, the crimes evolved into something even more sinister. In October 1979, several months after DeAngelo's termination from Auburn PD, the East Area Rapist's pattern changed dramatically. He moved his area of operations south to Southern California, and his crimes escalated from rape to murder. In Goleta, near Santa Barbara, the attacker now known as the Original Night Stalker murdered a couple in their home, shooting them to death after sexually assaulting the female victim. Over the next 7 years, the killer struck multiple times in Southern California, murdering victims in Goleta, Ventura, Dana Point, and Irvine. The murders typically involved couples being attacked in their homes late at night, with the perpetrator using firearms and bludgeoning weapons to kill his victims after subjecting them to sexual assault and terrorizing them with threats. The total confirmed victim count for the Original Night Stalker was at least 10 murders across 6 separate incidents, though some investigators believe there may have been additional victims whose deaths were not initially linked to the series. For decades, Law enforcement in California worked to identify and capture both the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, not initially realizing that they were the same person. The cases remained unsolved despite massive investigative efforts, thousands of hours of detective work, and the involvement of the FBI and other federal agencies. Advances in DNA technology in the 1990s and 2000s allowed investigators to link the East Area Rapist cases to the original Night Stalker murders through DNA evidence collected from crime scenes, confirming that the same perpetrator was responsible for both series of crimes, but the identity of that perpetrator remained unknown. Joseph DeAngelo, meanwhile, had seemingly moved on with his life after his termination from the Auburn Police Department. He took a job as a mechanic at a Save Mart grocery store distribution center, a position he would hold for 27 years until his retirement in 2017. He and his wife Sharon raised 3 daughters and lived in a modest home in Citrus Heights, ironically just miles from some of the neighborhoods he had terrorized as the East Area Rapist decades earlier. Neighbors described DeAngelo as an angry, volatile man who was prone to outbursts of screaming and cursing, often yelling at people for minor perceived slights like parking too close to his property or allowing their dogs to bark. He was involved in disputes with neighbors and exhibited controlling, aggressive behavior, but nothing that would have marked him as a suspect in one of California's most notorious unsolved serial crime sprees. The breakthrough in identifying DeAngelo came in April 2018 through the use of investigative genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that had never before been used to solve a serial murder case. Investigators uploaded DNA from East Area Rapist/original Night Stalker crime scenes to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database used by people researching their family trees. The DNA generated matches to distant relatives of the perpetrator, and by building family trees and using traditional genealogical research techniques, investigators were able to narrow down the pool of potential suspects to Joseph DeAngelo. Investigators placed DeAngelo under surveillance and collected his DNA from items he discarded in public, including tissues and objects he threw away. The DNA was tested and compared to crime scene evidence, and it matched conclusively. On April 24, 2018, a SWAT team descended on DeAngelo's Citrus Heights home and arrested the 72-year-old former police officer as he emerged from his garage. The arrest shocked the world, as one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history had been hiding in plain sight for over 4 decades, living an apparently normal suburban life while the crimes he had committed remained unsolved and his victims continued to suffer the trauma of their attacks. DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of murder and numerous counts of kidnapping, with the rape charges unable to be filed due to statutes of limitations that had expired decades earlier. His trial was one of the most anticipated criminal proceedings in California history, and victims and their families prepared to finally confront the man who had destroyed their lives so many years ago. However, in a controversial decision, prosecutors agreed to a plea deal in which DeAngelo would plead guilty to all 13 murders and admit to numerous other uncharged crimes, including the rapes and burglaries, in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty. The plea deal was accepted by many victims and their families who wanted to ensure that DeAngelo would be convicted and imprisoned for life without the risk of a trial that might result in lesser charges or the possibility of appeals that could drag on for decades. At the sentencing hearings, which took place over several days in August 2020, dozens of victims and family members of deceased victims gave impact statements, describing in devastating detail the ways DeAngelo's crimes had destroyed their lives, stolen their sense of security, and left them with lifelong trauma. DeAngelo sat in court in a wheelchair, appearing frail and elderly, a stark contrast to the terrifying predator he had been in his youth. He offered no apology, made no statement of remorse, and provided no explanation for his crimes. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced DeAngelo to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life sentence and 8 years, ensuring that he would die in prison. The Joseph DeAngelo case stands as one of the most significant examples of a law enforcement officer abusing his position and training to commit horrific crimes. His knowledge of police procedures, his access to information about investigations, and his understanding of how to avoid leaving evidence all contributed to his ability to evade capture for so long. The case also represented a landmark achievement in the use of investigative genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, a technique that has since been used to identify and arrest numerous other previously unknown offenders in unsolved cases across the country. The victims of Joseph DeAngelo, many of whom had waited more than 40 years for justice, finally saw their attacker held accountable, though the resolution could never undo the damage he had inflicted or restore the lives and sense of safety he had stolen from them and their communities. DeAngelo remains incarcerated in California State Prison, serving his multiple life sentences, a fallen officer whose betrayal of his oath and his community stands as one of the darkest chapters in American law enforcement history. Number 10. Norwood Jack Bailey. Norwood Jack Bailey was a United States Marshal, a federal law enforcement officer entrusted with protecting federal courts and pursuing fugitives. But his history of violence and inability to control his temper would lead to him murdering a fellow deputy marshal in a shocking act of workplace violence that exposed serious failures in the screening and oversight of federal law enforcement personnel. Born in 1949 in Missouri, Bailey grew up in the Midwest and pursued a career in law enforcement from a relatively young age. He served in various local police departments throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, though his employment history was marked by frequent job changes and allegations of excessive force and poor judgment. Despite these red flags, Bailey was hired by the United States Marshal Service in 1985, an appointment that should have required extensive background investigation and psychological evaluation but apparently did not uncover or adequately weigh the warning signs in his past. The United States Marshal Service is one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies, with responsibilities that include protecting federal judges, transporting federal prisoners, pursuing federal fugitives, and managing the Federal Witness Security Program. Deputy marshals are expected to exercise sound judgment, maintain professionalism under stress, and uphold the highest standards of conduct, as they often operate with significant autonomy and carry the authority of the federal government. Bailey was assigned to the District of Kansas and worked primarily on fugitive investigations and prisoner transport. Colleagues who worked with Bailey during his years as a deputy marshal reported that he was competent in many technical aspects of the job but had a volatile personality, was quick to anger, and sometimes used excessive force when dealing with prisoners or suspects. There were complaints filed against him by prisoners who alleged that Bailey had assaulted them during transport or used gratuitous violence during arrests. But these complaints were either not fully investigated or resulted in minimal disciplinary action. The culture within some law enforcement agencies during this period often tolerated aggressive behavior from officers, particularly when the victims of that aggression were criminal defendants or convicted offenders whose credibility was automatically questioned. Bailey also had conflicts with fellow deputies, engaging in verbal altercations and creating a hostile work environment for those he worked with. On November 28, 1989, Bailey's history of violence reached its tragic culmination when he shot and killed Deputy United States Marshal Frank Przebyszewski in the federal courthouse in Kansas City, Kansas. The circumstances of the shooting emerged from witness testimony and investigative reports. Bailey and Przebyszewski had been involved in an ongoing personal and professional conflict, with disagreements about work assignments, investigative techniques, and interpersonal matters creating tension between them. On the day of the shooting, the two men were both in the United States Marshal's office within the federal courthouse when an argument erupted between them. Witnesses reported that the argument became increasingly heated, with both men raising their voices and exchanging insults. Bailey, who was armed with his service weapon as all deputy marshals routinely are while on duty, drew his firearm during the altercation and shot Przebyszewski multiple times at close range. Przebyszewski, who did not draw his own weapon or defend himself, was struck by several bullets and fell to the floor critically wounded. Other deputy marshals and courthouse personnel immediately responded to the sound of gunshots, finding Bailey standing over Przebyszewski with his weapon still drawn. Przebyszewski was rushed to a hospital but died from his wounds shortly after arrival. He was 42 years old and had been a deputy marshal for over 15 continuous 17:00 years, leaving behind a wife and children. The murder of a federal law enforcement officer by another federal law enforcement officer was virtually unprecedented and sent shockwaves through the Marshal Service and the broader law enforcement community. Bailey was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder under federal law. The investigation into the shooting revealed that the argument between Bailey and Przebyszewski had been about work-related matters but had escalated far beyond any reasonable level of professional disagreement. Bailey's attorneys would later attempt to argue that he had acted in a moment of extreme emotional disturbance, or that there had been some element of self-defense involved, but the evidence thoroughly contradicted these claims. Multiple witnesses testified that Przebyszewski had not threatened Bailey or drawn his weapon, and that Bailey had been the clear aggressor who had escalated the argument to violence. Bailey's trial took place in federal court in 1990, and the prosecution presented a straightforward case of premeditated murder. They demonstrated that Bailey had a history of violence and poor impulse control, that he had drawn and fired his weapon without legal justification, and that his actions constituted murder under federal law. The defense struggled to present a coherent alternative theory, and the jury quickly convicted Bailey of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence he is still serving decades later in a federal penitentiary. The murder of Deputy Marshal Przebyszewski raised urgent questions about how the United States Marshal Service screened and supervised its personnel. How had Bailey, with his documented history of violence and complaints against him, been allowed to remain in federal law enforcement for years without more serious intervention? Why had the warning signs of his dangerous temperament not resulted in his termination or, at minimum, his removal from active duty pending psychological evaluation? The Marshal Service conducted an internal review of Bailey's hiring and employment, and while the full findings were not made public, the agency implemented reforms to its hiring practices, including more rigorous psychological screening, more thorough background investigations that specifically examined an applicant's history of violence or excessive force complaints, and enhanced supervision of deputies who exhibited warning signs of dangerous behavior. The case also led to changes in workplace violence prevention protocols within federal law enforcement agencies more broadly, with recognition that the armed nature of law enforcement work and the high-stress environment created unique risks that required proactive management. For the family of Frank Przebyszewski, the loss was devastating and senseless. He had been murdered not by a criminal he was pursuing or a dangerous fugitive he was attempting to apprehend, but by a fellow officer who should have been a trusted colleague. His widow and children struggled with the traumatic nature of his death and the betrayal represented by a fellow marshal taking his life. The United States Marshal Service honored Przebyszewski's memory and service, and his name is inscribed on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C., alongside other officers who died in the line of duty. Nor would Bailey's conviction and life sentence brought justice in the legal sense, but it could not restore Frank Przebyszewski's life or heal the damage done to his family and to the institution of the United States Marshal Service. Bailey's case remains a stark reminder that law enforcement agencies must maintain rigorous screening, ongoing evaluation, and zero tolerance for violence and unprofessional conduct among their personnel, and that the failure to address warning signs and remove dangerous individuals from positions of authority can have catastrophic consequences. Today, Bailey remains incarcerated in the federal prison system, an elderly man serving a life sentence for the murder of a colleague, a fallen officer whose crime was not committed in pursuit of justice or in defense of others, but in an act of workplace violence driven by anger, ego, and an inability to control his most destructive impulses, a betrayal of everything the badge and the oath of a federal law enforcement officer are meant to represent.